Welcome to Secrets from the Scene, a show for local musicians who want to improve their music, grow their audience, and learn about Minnesota's music scene. If you're interested in talking about all things music related and meeting interesting people from our local community, you're in the right place. Welcome to Secrets from the Scene. My name is Stephen Helvig, and I'm your host. If this is your first time joining the podcast, thank you so much for checking it out. And if you're a repeat listener, thank you so much for coming back. This podcast is all about the Minnesota music scene, and we interview artists, producers, engineers, retail owners, venue owners, photographers, publicists, and anybody else that makes up the music scene. The goal of the podcast is educational and also to highlight all the cool people and places and events that are happening around the town. Today's episode is going to be cool. It's going to be pretty technical. And if you are listening to the audio only version of this podcast, it might be time for you to head over to YouTube or Spotify and check out the video version, as we're going to do a third camera to go deep into snare drum tuning. Today's guest is Eric Amendrud. He's a drum expert. He's lived in Nashville for many years, servicing recording studios and touring artists, and knows everything when it comes to drums. For that reason, today's episode is also going to be different in the sense that I'm going to have my right-hand man, Max Green, be the host. Max is also a drummer, so I figured I'd let the drum nerds do their nerding out together. And on that topic, I do want to just say a big thanks to Max and also the editor, Joey Bean, because without those two, this podcast definitely wouldn't have happened. They put in a ton of work every week to get the episodes edited, to make all the clips, and I just want to say how grateful I am for making that happen. As we are getting close to the end of what I'm going to call season one. It's been a long season one. We're nearing 60 episodes, and I think we're going to take a break for a little bit. So thank you everybody who has said hello or thank you or introduced ideas for episodes, introduced guests. It all really helps. We appreciate it. If you haven't yet, please consider clicking subscribe on YouTube, hitting like on Spotify, leaving a rating wherever you can, Apple Podcasts on Spotify. That really helps, and we deeply appreciate it. We appreciate the support. So without further ado, I'm going to swap it over to Max and Eric Amendrud.
All right, Eric. Thanks for coming out.
Thanks, Max.
Thanks for having this. We met down in Rochester, down at Carpet Booth Studios, a kind of like a musicians networking open house kind of thing, and Secrets from the Scene had a booth and you had a booth, and I remember just walking by and seeing this big banner that said the Nashville Drum Doctors, and I was like, wait a second, I've heard of that guy before, and went and talked to you, and we geeked out about snare drums and tuning and all sorts of stuff, and I was like, we have to have this guy in the podcast, so thanks for being a guest.
Pleasure to be here.
First off, let's kind of just dive into your background. You're the drum doctor, but how did you get that name, and what is the story behind the Nashville Drum Doctors?
So I started building drums as a hobby.
Okay.
And it just kind of kept me busy. I was kind of the drummer that really kind of had to know what was going on with his drums to make them sound good. So I thought, well, maybe I'm a woodworker. You know, I come from that background, and finishing work and cabinetry and all that stuff. And I decided to kind of start building my own drums, and I got a job in Nashville working at the drum supply house.
Sweet.
And we serviced drummers all over the country and world, in fact, and got to know some of the people in the business, and I started kind of messing around myself, and maybe bought a little too many drums over time, but I experimented quite a bit, and then I started doing my own thing, making shells and stave drums and lathing drums, so taking a big chunk of wood and just carving it up on a lathe and just trying to experiment with different sounds, and what if I did this, what if I did that, and then I kind of turned it into a rental business because I had so many drums.
Okay.
So met a lot of drummers that way. They'd come over and just kind of experiment. Oh, I've never seen an ash log before, and I'd tell them all the little nuances about the snare drum, and some places would rent quite a few just to get them through the day, because a snare drum, as we talked about, it's kind of the main mule of a song.
Yeah.
Coming from a drum standpoint. So it's important to know how to tune your snare drum. So I kind of dove into that and got a few breaks, I guess they say, along the way. I'd lived there 3 different times. I'm also a player and play music and play drums and teach and do all those things. But I've always come back to just kind of experimenting with the snare drum, because it's just so easy to change that part of your drum equipment out. And it gives you a whole new flavor. You know, it's different to play on. It's, you know, it looks cool. And, you know, it's just kind of accentuation of who we are as a player, you know, and that was my first instrument. I started on the snare drum. That's all I had. I had a 6-lug, Slingerland copy of a snare drum that wasn't good in the first place. And it was made of Luan. It's the stuff they make the doors out of, you know? Yeah. And, I remember playing that thing with my Buddy Rich album, and I couldn't play a lick, but as long as I was playing along, I felt connected, you know.
Yeah.
And I think the snare drum is that for me as a drummer. You know, there's lots of things to hit, but the snare drum kind of gives us the most options, I think. And so I really kind of dove into that first. I started making snare drums first, and then slowly started making drum sets and different kinds of drum sets, you know, acrylic and different shells and that kind of stuff. So
cool. So you had this giant library of drums. How big was the collection, and then where did you get all these drums? And where'd you store them? Like what is that story?
That's a big point. When you start collecting drums, and I think most drummers start with one, you know, it's all it takes is one. And then they get something to practice on, and they do all these things. Well, I had that too, but I was pretty good at just, you know, if I had a drum set, I'd use that. And then if I wanted something else, I'd trade it or you know, get something else and get rid of that one.
Okay.
But then I found that it's nice to have a few options. And, I started again making those drums as hobbies.
Okay.
And I kept it because they're quite expensive, you know, to build just a custom kit. You look on internet, it's going to cost you, you know,
thousands,
quite a bit. Thousands of dollars. So you kind of want to research it. You're like, oh, what would I like to keep? And you realize, okay, I have 6 snare drums, and then it turns into 12. And then you start trading, or, you know, I started buying a lot of used drum gear because it's a little cheaper, and, you know, I like fixing stuff, and just that was kind of a hobby for me.
And then you learn about it too.
You learn like, I know that this needs this kind of screw. Then I started getting kind of smart, and I started making the business side of what I was doing, and I'd buy in bulk, and I'd do more than, you know, so now I'm making 6 snare drums a day, and I'm selling 5 and keeping 1, and you do that enough times, and now I've
builds
got,
and builds and builds.
And builds. And so at one time I had 215 snare drums, and that's a lot for one person to have, but the space alone it costs you money.
Did you have to like rent out a warehouse or a rental space?
So I got pretty lucky. I rented a storage unit where I was really good friends with the owner, and they're like, if you need another storage unit, put a lock on it. We'll charge you, prorate you,
nice.
You know, do whatever. So I was trading a lot of drums, and that's where it gets equitable, I suppose, is to invest in drums, especially with what I was doing. If I could rent out 10 drums and I could only play once, you know. So renting those out was important. So having something to pick from is good. I would trade a lot, you know, and my snares aren't very cheap. So, you know, maybe give me your old drum set and a couple $100 or something, and I'll give you this drum, and everybody wins that way. So I did a lot of that. And then Craigslist was big back then. So you just look up Craigslist. People want to trade stuff. You know, craziest thing I ever traded, a snare drum for a handgun. So that was pretty crazy.
I suppose down in Nashville, probably.
Yeah. But in the South, they like things that go bang.
That's cool. Sweet. So then that was a big part of your business, was selling the drums and trading drums and building drums. But then people would sometimes call you just to come and tune their kit, or
whether it's they call it a roadie gig, or it's like a tuning session that the drums just need to be tuned like they were before, you know, or tune them to something specific, because that's a little more hard, more fine tuned, is to get a snare drum, it might be a mystery drum, to sound like something else.
Okay.
It's a little harder that way.
So people, would they have like I want my kit to sound like this?
Yeah, that's a certain sound like they're going for, and this is what we have to work with. If not, that's where I had the luxury of going, oh, I got that, you know, or I'm going to build it, take me 2 days.
Gotcha.
Whatever. So I had that luxury. I still do. I still really enjoy that. If I join a band or something, I need a snare drum, I'll just build it and match my kit. And it's just pretty nice that way.
That's awesome. Yeah.
But,
Sweet.
So getting to the point where you have all that to offer, it's incentive for a lot of drummers to create that community. We had a lot of lunching days where you'd sit and talk about drums all lunch, and it's just fun to talk to drummers. I think that's unique. I don't know as if guitar players do that, but
yeah, there's a special bond between drummers for sure. And I suppose, that helps. You go out to lunch with someone, you talk about drums with them, and then the next time they need help with their kit, or the next time they need to buy another drum, they're going to go to you because you have a relationship. They're not just going to go to Guitar Center.
Sure.
That's smart. I think now we can kind of pivot more into the drum tuning specific questions. Before we do that, basically, I just want to say, you have a drum, you have a top head, a bottom head, you have a rim on each one, and then you have lug nuts. And the whole general idea is to get each lug nut the same tension so that the drum is it sounds the same all around, and so that the drum is at a good pitch and everything around sounds even. And then depending on how you want it to sound, you can make the bottom head tighter or higher pitched than the top head. You can make the top head tighter or looser than the bottom head, and you can experiment with the way that the drum sounds. And you can tune it a million different ways. And there's a million different methods. There's a million different people on YouTube telling you how to tune. And there's all these different things. Or when I started playing drums, I played guitar before. And when you tune a guitar, you plug your guitar into a tuner. You pluck the string, bam, 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 goes to a note, you're in tune. But with the drums, and for people who aren't drummers, they might not know this, it's completely different.
And where I started with all that is that I didn't touch it. I just made it work. So it wouldn't break, and I left it. And I think a lot of drummers come to that point where they don't want to dive in because they're scared they're going to break something.
Yeah.
And that is true. But how I started to learn how to do all this is I took it apart, completely apart, polished it up, and because I was proud of it. I got my first custom snare drum. I wanted to see what it was made out of. Mm-hmm. So I took it all apart, had a really thin shell. So it was a 6-ply. Maple shell, but the edge that was on there, that's the top part that touches the drum head. And when we squeeze down on the tension lugs on the rods, they pull that tight. And unlike a guitar where you tune that tuning peg, you tune one of these, you're only tuning 1/10 or 1/8 or 1/6 of what you have to offer. Mm-hmm. And so it needs to be done equally. I learned that by taking it apart, I could see what parts I had to work with. And then when I learned about those parts and what those did to change it, I could fine tune my sound according to what I would want to hear in my head. But if I have a drum that I'm trying to tune, I want to see really how much tension I have on each of those lugs. The only way to do that is to start over. And a lot of times I didn't want to take apart because I was just afraid if something was going to break. Because those drum heads now, they're not cheap. Mm-hmm. And drummers don't necessarily have all that much spending income. And it's an investment.
And it can be daunting to start, what heads do I buy? What snare drum do I buy? How is this all going to mix and match and work together? So when you have a drum, do you have a go-to set of heads that you just put on it? Or do you kind of base your decision on drum heads depending on the drum and the size and the wood? Or where do you go about with picking heads and then deciding how you're going to tune it and kind of what's your kind of approach with that?
Well, my approach is that I try to build the drum around the shell.
Okay.
And so if the shell is a certain size, like you talked about, different depths, different thicknesses, I start with what I've got to work with. So if it's a drum that is wooden or metal, it's going to change slightly what I'm going to use as drum heads. But I like a coated ambassador on the top, something medium weight. Drum companies do change their sound based upon how they're crimped and how they're built. So I take that into consideration if I'm going for a different kind of sound.
Okay.
So drum heads aren't necessarily as important as the condition.
Gotcha.
They're working condition, no holes. If they're new, great.
Yeah.
If they're old, they can be used. The old duct tape will work just fine, but don't like using it. But you got to start somewhere. So with whatever you have, just knowing that you want to know you're using good materials, that's going to end you up in success. So by taking it all apart, I'm using my hands. I'm not using the drum keys. I'm also using tools and stuff too. But ultimately, I'm trying to get to know what that drum consists of so that I can later on get the best product out of what I get to work with. And typically I tune the bottom side first because there's so many problems with the snare wires or, knowing which ones to use. And we'll dive into all that. But all those parts in conjunction with each other are important. So I try to look at the snare drum bed, which is that bottom side. It's got an indent in there that will give a certain amount of depth to have those wires sit in there nice so that they do their job. And the drums are all different. They can have different snare beds. And so I like to look at what I'm working with there so I know how tight to tune my bottom side head. Because if it's pretty deep, it's going to take a long time and a lot of turns to turn those bottom lugs in that spot where that snare bed's sitting. So that will cause ripples in your drum head if it's not tight all the way, which is okay. It doesn't translate to all that bad, but it will tear, it will rip. And over time, it will vibrate enough to where it wears a hole in it. So if it's tight, it'll do its job more correctly. So knowing what I'm working with there as far as a snare bed goes is important. So then I typically use just a standard medium weight hazy head on the bottom. Yeah, that hazy head to get that real thin head. The thinner, the better if you're trying to create more articulation, meaning more attack from your snare drum hit, whether it's soft or loud.
Okay.
The tuning does play a part in how a person plays too. So that's something we didn't talk about, is that snare drum tuning is player's choice. It's how hard am I going to hit that? And sometimes we don't tune for the way we play. We just tune according to what the drum's going to give us. And so that's something to take in consideration. So, and sometimes too, I tune the drums really how the player likes to play, not just necessarily for myself. I guess that kind of information can be interpreted how whatever gig you're doing or why you're tuning the drum in the first place.
So you start with everything loose, you go finger tight, start with the bottom head. You get that dialed in.
Yes, and I start there, and I use that bottom head, and I don't tighten it up all the way because I want to get the snares placed first.
So you just go finger tight.
Yeah, because I want to see, because that's one trick that I don't think most people know is that when I'm tightening that snare throw off, and however that mechanism works, and we've talked about it a lot, that snare mechanism is bent. It isn't working right. It's kind of crooked, but we're still going to use it, so that does affect how it pulls up on those snare wires or the snare thread or the snare cord or whatever it is, a strap, whatever you're using, that's going to pull up on that a certain way based upon how it's made, how it's built. And so I kind of see how it throws off, because some throw offs have different positions. There's all kinds of different throw offs now, but I like to see how that works, and then actually put the butt plate, the back side of the snare, I tighten those up first so that I have a reference point to align my wires. And so on the other side, when I get the backside straight, I'll take my fingers, and this is where it kind of gets tricky, because it's hard when you're down there and working, and it's like you need three hands. Mm-hmm. I mean, what drummer doesn't want three hands? But it takes two different sides of the hand that is, you kind of work with it, and you've done it enough. It's hard to explain, easier to show, but it's inevitable that you got to hold a few things while you tighten things, and it's a little trickier. So to get that all straight, that number one, I think, is the number one problem why most drummers don't dive into the snare drum, because of that very thing. You get your snare wires crooked, it's going to change. It's going to make your life miserable when you're trying to tune it.
I've ran into that problem before, where snare drum that I have here, I got it, and it came with the plastic straps that held the snares on, and I would play, and by the end of the gig, it didn't matter how much I tightened the snare throw, the snares would just be loose and they would hardly be touching the head. And I was like, why is this happening? What's going on?
And sometimes when that one little strand on the back side is loose, because there's two sides there, and sometimes it doesn't take a drum key, which is really important if you have a snare drum that has no drum key tuning to use that screwdriver, because inevitably it'll get stripped, and then you have all kinds of problems, and then you can't get that tight, and then you use duct tape again. No, but something to make that straight and less headache there. So I straighten up the wires, and then I tighten them, and I see how far down. So I have the bottom side snare head with the snares on top of it, and I don't have it tightened all the way, and there's just a little bit of crimple in that snare drum bed so that I can see the space I have to work with. Gotcha. And so that's just an eyeball thing. I don't really think about it. I know how much space is there, because as I tune that bottom side snare head down in the star pattern, I'm going to inevitably tune, I guess it's the 4 and this 7. Whatever way you're going, depends on what number, but the 2 numbers on either side of the snare bed, I'm going to tune those a fuller turn, more than a half turn that I usually turn, so that I can get that down faster. And inevitably, those overtones are going to create difference because it's not
even.
It's not even, right? So I want that, because I want the bottom side to go down faster than the sides because they're higher, and I don't want to pull that drum head out of there.
So you're compensating for the snare bed.
I'm compensating for the snare bed, and I make that go down first.
Gotcha.
Tighten first, and then the other sides. And that gives me more to work with as far as pulling out, because inevitably you tighten down the snare drum head side, it's going to pull. That's a really thin, hazy film. It's going to pull easy. Yeah. The important thing is to not go too tight,
because you can bust through.
Right.
I've done that. Put a brand new bottom head on, go too tight. You start playing, all of a sudden, and you're like, oh no.
So as soon as those crimps go away and those ripples, I'll start tuning the sides, and then I'll try to get a nice clear tone from the bottom side without any snares on it. And then I engage the snare wires, and then I kind of fine tune how they're pulling, and I feel how much tension is on the wires, and I make sure that they're in a straight line. And even sides on either side of the snare head, so that I can see inside the drum.
And when you're tuning the bottom head, is there an ideal pitch in mind, or are you just kind of?
Well, I start with the lowest pitch.
Okay.
Because I can go up from there. And again, yes, I start with the lowest possible pitch, where my wires are not muted by the head, but they're not buzzing completely either, because we didn't talk about the tension of the snare throw on the wires, because you can control that as you go, as the head's done and tightened.
Yeah.
So that will ultimately create some pull on the tension head too. So I compensate for that by not tightening it too tight, but I also, and depending on how I'm going to play it to what sound I want, I might crank it up all the way, as tight as it wants to go. But then, I engage it, I disengage it, and then I engage it again, because I want to see how much tension is pulling on the head now that it's tuned. And so then I do that, and then I see if I like that sound where I'm getting enough rattle. Then I know that I'm going to have a better access to differentiate what I want from the top head. Okay. And so tuning the top head, then my bottom head is basically tuned already. Yeah. I shut the snares off, and then I'm very careful, because it's not recommended to put the bottom head on first, because you're inevitably going to drop something in that. And so if you're, not aware, you might wreck that bottom head that's already on. So typically I like to do the snare drum side first and get that out of the way.
So when you go top head, what's kind of your
so then the star
there?
Pattern again, but I really like taking my 3 fingers underneath the head and putting my fingers on the shell to feel the amount of space between this side and the other side, so that I get that on straight.
So it's even, so that way you're not fighting a head that is more
onto
one side or the other, and
yes.
you're not overcompensating.
Yep.
Because
so that's
very
important.
Smart.
It's very important. And so as I'm tuning it, and I put my hands, and again, this is the part where I wish I had 3 hands, and you're turning the lugs with the tension lugs with your hands, but you're also holding the space in between the head and the rim and your fingers, and you're kind of, I mean, it takes a little practice, but you can kind of see it too.
So you're always constantly thinking, keep this
even, just keeping it even
Gotcha.
while I get, because I'm not going to tighten it tension up yet. It's all finger tight, and inevitably some tension lugs might be a little bit blocked or they're a little crooked or something. So again, taking it all apart, you'll know that hey, those need to be straightened. But typically, you can tighten them to the point where the drum head is touching the edge of the shell. It becomes a bearing edge, and once it touches that bearing edge, I start to tighten in the star pattern with my fingers, pulling down on the head just a little bit, not to pull it so that it tweaks the shell or to even really put much pressure on it, just so that I know that it's tight.
Gotcha.
And there's no space in there. And so now that it's fully hand tightened, and I got pretty strong hands, so it helps to feel those tension rods and get them pretty tight, because once I put the key on it, I'm only going to start with half turns in the star pattern, and then as it gets tight, then I'll start to get more like a 3/4 turn, almost a full turn of the drum key as I go up in pitch. But as I tighten it, before I put the drum key on it, I'm tapping on it to see how it responds with the snare wires.
To the center or to each lug?
All of them. I start with one lug that I might be working on. I start with this, and I kind of flip over to my other hand just to see if I got kind of a relative pitch, because it's going to change. Yeah. And so it doesn't have to be even the whole entire time. It's just going to end up even. So inevitably something's going to stretch, and this is going tighter. And that's why I like 2 drum keys at the same time, so that I get that cross tension to be straight down, and so I can feel it. And then so I gradually work my way up, and then once I have it kind of where I've got it fully turned, just kind of one rotation where it starts to get that click of the drum head, where it's trying to seat and stuff like that. That's when I know, okay, now I got to be real careful of how much tension I have, so I don't go past the full turn, because inevitably that drum head's going to do what it's going to do, and it's going to change. So it's going to change what I do. And so I'm kind of feeling, okay, how tight is this? So I go to the feel. How tight does it feel when I'm turning it? Then I've kind of switched into the feel mode, where I'm trying to keep each turn that I do as tight as the last one.
Okay.
So that I know that I'm keeping that tension, the same tightness, so I don't over tighten one and then gives me a false overtone or it's pulling too much.
So the name of the game is just even and consistent. I remember when I was starting to learn how to tune, it was like memorize the feel of, all right, this is how far I moved my hand. I need to do the same there, because if this is too cranked over here and this isn't, or if this, like what you said, when you're taking your drums apart, if this lug just naturally is harder to turn,
tight,
you
right?
might think that it's as tight as the rest of them, but it might not be. So it's like, just be aware of the drum, and if there's anything wrong with it, to compensate with that or get it replaced or whatever. But then, yeah,
absolutely. And I think what happens is that when we are turning those things and we're tightening them, it's hard to know what all the other lugs are doing at the same time. And so that's why I kind of like to look at it, and I push down. Again, I'm holding the rim in place. I'd like to push down a little bit to see how much, if it is giving, how much give it has. And I can typically tell if it's too tight, but it is difficult to adjust that. And so knowing how much you turn it is important, because you can kind of forget which lug you're on and this and that. But that's why it's important to kind of pull down with both hands and have a nice surface to have all that happen on as well. So getting started with the feel is important. Taking it apart a couple times. It's okay to try over, if you forget.
So then from that point, you basically then just hit it, see how it sounds, and then just make adjustments there depending on what you're going for, or?
Yeah. And then feel is important at this point. So knowing what kind of surface you like playing on is important, how that rebound happens. There's a video on YouTube that shows something slow, the drum being hit in slow motion, and you can see how much give it has. Well, it's inevitable that a head that's not as tight has more rebound because it has more flex. And so if we think of it in logistics that way, where the less tight it is, the more flap you have. It takes away that flap because inevitably it's tightening it up really tight. And so if you crank it down as far as the drum will go, you can do some physical damage to drums. You can really crank it down, but it's fun. You crank it down and playing that and give that rebound that feels like you're playing on a sidewalk, and it's just really, really easy to play. If that's just what you're going after, that's how you achieve it. You get everything as tight as you can possibly get it. But inevitably, you got to make sure that that's what you're wanting to do with your drum.
So if you're going for a really fat, low, wet cereal box sound, then you'll tune it really low. If you're going for that really cracking, metally kind of sound and you want that rebound, you go way tighter. How does this then, that's the snare drum, is it similar methods then with toms? Obviously you don't have snares on the bottom of your toms and end of your kick, but is it kind of similar process where you'll start on the bottom and then go to the top, or what's your approach with toms and like kick drum?
Yeah, I guess the bottom is okay, really, because the tonality comes from the bottom heads. Top heads attack, is attack side and then the resonant side. So resonance is that pitch that we get. So I like to typically get my pitch before I get my attack side, because I can play, most players, if they know it or not, can play on different surfaces, but it's a lot easier to play in that sweet spot where it gives you that rebound, where you're not having to give it much strike. The rebound is just more controlled rather than something that's loose. You're going to have to put more of a stroke into it. You're controlling more of the rebound because it's not going to give you much. I mean, you still play on it, but then again, the lower sound, you have to hit it a little different. You can't force it. There's many different ways to play the snare drum, but it works all in conjunction with each other. So it's important to know really what you want to play on and then what kind of range you have within that. So experimenting is important. Maybe you like both. Yeah. Maybe anything's for you, or maybe, hey, I want to have as much dampening on there as I can. I don't want to have any snare buzz, short attack. That's okay too. It really depends on what you're going for.
When I first met you, what you brought to my attention was there's different rims, and
yes,
the rims can affect not only the sound, but also they can affect how fast you bust through sticks, and I didn't really realize that. And then I look at my snare drum and I have I don't know what kind of rim it is, but it
flanges out.
I chop through a lot of sticks,
Yeah, you're hitting that rim just right. And so that is important because, again, we're given what whoever made the drum put on there. That's the way they did it. Well, why question it? So I think the hobby of taking things apart and putting them back together and trying to modify it comes into play. And I realized working at the drum supply house that there's more than one product out there to pick from too. And now the internet will give you all kinds of options and stuff. And so sound becomes limitless. I personally like all different kinds of hoops. It depends on what band I'm playing in. And so as a player, you don't really know that because, hey, I'm in a band and, I got the snare drum and it just works. I'm not going to change it. Why change it? So when you're in the discussion of having something different and you wanting different sounds, it's an easy fix to change that sound without having to buy a new snare drum.
Okay.
And I found that when I had my first custom drum, I took the die-cast hoops off and I put on wood hoops. And I really, really liked the sound of it. The back stick was really nice. And if you think you got more wood to hit, it's going to sound more like wood, right? So there's the concept there. But there's so many different manufacturers of die cast and metals and brass and all those different kinds of things. And lug spacing matters too. We didn't talk about that yet, but the hoops themselves can be changed top and bottom. They don't have to be the same throughout. They don't have to match, but typically they do to give those overtones that are similar. But we can achieve different sounds if we do change those things out. And so, buying things, hoops that are made well is important. If you have the luxury of having the hoop in your hand, you really want to make sure that it's in round, because something that's out of round slightly will change the way that we tune. And that's important too. When you take it apart, there's ways to tell how, is this hoop in round? Is it circular? You can't really tell at first. It might look like a circle, but is it really circular? and you can tap it. You can do the tap test and see what kind of pitch it makes. That's typically the telltale sign of how it's going to resonate when you hit it on the drum too. So if it's kind of out of pitch, or it gives you a honky kind of sound where it's just really not vibrating well, chances are that hoop's not going to give you what you want. So you just get a different hoop.
You could have your drum and then try to tune it for hours and wonder why it's not working. And maybe the hoop is bent. Maybe a lug is broken. Maybe the shell is dented, or the drum is warped or whatever. So that's always something to keep in mind.
Separated. That ply separation really wreaks havoc on those antique drums and vintage drums. The humidity, it makes the glue decompose inside of the plies that they've put together, and inside the shell, they'll separate. And sometimes you can see that evidently by taking the drum head off, and there's a little space in there. But what that equates to is the drum now is absorbing that vibration, not sending it and doing what it's supposed to do, but absorbing it. And now, it sounds dead. It's hard to tune. Well, separate it. So it's not an easy fix, but it can be fixed.
It's good to know there's a lot of problems that can happen that you just don't even think about.
Yeah.
Let's take a minute to talk about our sponsor, Helvig Productions, which just so happens to be my studio. Are you a musician here in the Twin Cities, currently releasing music and ready to upgrade your sound? If you're tired of underwhelming recordings and want a polished, professional sound that gets people talking, we're here to help. We'll work with you to transform your next song into a production that feels impeccable, gets your friends singing along, and catches the attention of your soon-to-be new fans. And here's my guarantee. Give us 7 days to deliver a mix you love, or we'll keep working for free until you're 100% satisfied. If that sounds compelling, here's how it works. First, we'll start with a pre-production analysis where we focus on the core of everything, the songwriting and arrangement. We'll give you an honest, outside perspective to make sure your song is on track for the sound you want. And if it needs a few tweaks, we'll give you some tips and work with you to make improvements. If you want a deeper writing collaboration, we can bring in a specialized songwriter to assist. Either way, you keep full ownership of your music, no matter what. Once that's locked in, we'll jump into the professional recording and production process. This is where we capture the best performance of each part from start to finish. We'll handle everything from detailed recording to expert vocal production, editing, tuning, mixing, and mastering. Plus, all our best production assistants along the way. We've got top-notch gear, a great live room, and most importantly, over 15 years of experience helping artists get their best performances. This process has helped our clients build real fan bases and even land on Spotify playlists. We've got the results to back it up. Sharkoff built a fan base from scratch with over 99,000 YouTube subscribers and over 60 million views across platforms. Silver Warehouse got their very first single playlisted by Spotify, racking up over 3 million plays. Waltzing on Waves had a song from their debut album playlisted on Spotify, amassing 2 million plays. Ludwig landed sync deals with brands like Hyundai and shows like All American. And we've got over 80 5-star reviews on Google. So if that's all you need to hear and you're ready to chat, head to helvigproductions.com/letsconnect or click the link in our show notes. We'll have you fill out a quick questionnaire, and if we're not a match, we'll let you know up front. We only work with clients who are a strong fit for our strengths because we're not satisfied until you are. If this sounds good to you, click that link and let's get started. I'm excited to see what we can create together.
Your thoughts on, and before you answer, I'll give you kind of my thoughts about this, and I'm curious to see what you have to say. So, drum dials, torque keys, tune bots, for people that don't know what they are. A drum dial is a little mechanism you put on your drum on each lug. It has like a little meter, tells you how tight it is, and you can kind of go around and measure the tightness of each lug. Torque key, you put it on, you set it to a certain tension, you twist it, and it pops when it hits that certain tension. You can kind of go around and roughly get your drum evenly tightened. And then a drum bot, a little battery-powered mechanism that has a little microphone on it. Toss it on each lug, you hit it, it tells you the frequency that it's at, and you can go around and try to make each lug even. I bought a tune bot, didn't really find that it worked for me, so I kind of gave up on that. And then years later, I got a torque key and I got a drum dial, and I found if I start, do the finger tight thing, and then go with the torque key, then go with the drum dial and fine tune it from there, that was something that worked really well for me. I also found like at a gig or something, if you're in a last minute and you break a head and you got to swap heads, or if it's a really noisy environment and you don't really have time to tune your drums, the tour key can be a good like quick fix. But some people might say those are all like cheating, or those aren't that accurate, or you got to know how to do it by tapping and do it by ear. And so I'm just curious to see what your thoughts are on tour keys, drum dials, tune bots, that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, I kind of look at it like tuning a guitar. People use a pedal, there's a noise, and you click on the tuner and you see if your string is in tune, and you tune it up. There's people that use that, and that gets you in relatively good pitch, especially if you got a good tuner. And they make tuners for drums, like you said, that tune bot. It's so hard to use that you need education at Harvard to figure out the directions, because I had experiences just like what you're saying, and they're tools that can be used correctly to get you a place where you don't even have to think about it. It's just going to tell you. And that's what I think a lot of people need. And so it's a good guide to say, okay, like for instance, teachers that are trying to tune a drum for the first time, they stick that drum dial on there, and the directions are really easy. They're simple. It shows you the meter, shows you what's going on. It will achieve exactly what we're talking about with precise qualifications, and you'll get there a lot easier than you would without it. If you know and you've done it several times, then it becomes a tool that you no longer need.
Kind of like training wheels in a way.
It's training wheels, which is great because you're understanding the concept. It's teaching you, it's showing you, it's telling you. So that's important, but we don't all have access to that. So the concept is still the same. We're still going to tune it the same, but then again, are you going to need another hand to, now you need 4 hands instead of 3. But the point is that it's a tool that can be used correctly, get there very efficiently. But it doesn't tell you any of the problems again. So that, I think, is the main thing that we as drummers, we can use these tools, but we also still need to have the education. You still need to know what A440 is if, tuning a guitar. You still need to know what the fundamentals are really tuning a drum. So then it becomes, okay, what makes it easier for me? So if the tension tuning key, you can set it, and I've even seen ones where the ratio is different. So they have a drum key, I think it's called Robo Key. I don't know if they make it anymore. You turn it, it's 2 turns instead of 1. And so it gets you there faster, which is great for untuning, because really if you're taking off a drum head, most of the time you're going to change it.
Yeah.
It's okay if you untune that one all the way, and all the rest of the tensions is an unequal tension. Oh my gosh, that's bad, but let's look and see what happens. So this is how it feels, the tension that, this is loose, and, some people tune their drums like that. That's a special technique. They take and loosen their backside snare to get that fat snare. The rest of it's still tight. So when you're talking about using that key, you're getting tension equal, but it's just the tension that's put on the tension rod. It doesn't mean that it's as tight as the one that you just did, meaning pulling it down as much as it is. But the drum dial does that, tells you how much tension is pulled on there. So, and you mentioned the third one, the drum bot itself, like you said, is so hard to use.
Yeah.
That's
why I got rid of it.
But it's a good concept when you're in a studio and you need C sharp.
Yeah. Okay. If you're tuning to a note.
And this drum is in between, you've got all the pitches. And this is, you're tuning a xylophone, for instance, and you're carving it or whatever. That has to be a certain pitch or within a relatively close amount of sense. And so that's where that's used to the T. And what's difficult is now what that drum bot doesn't take into consideration is that you have a bottom head too, or you have a top head too. What's that doing? Well, I don't know. The drum bot isn't quite that smart yet.
Have you ever been in a scenario with like a client or yourself where you had to tune drums to certain notes or like pitches?
Absolutely.
How do you go about that?
You get the shell. Okay. And DW did a good job of this with their collector series. They put a note in the shell. So when it's bare, no holes are drilled, bing, they hit it with a mallet. What does it say? Oh, it's really in between C sharp, C. Here's the fundamental note that this shell gives you. Great. We all know about notes, harmonics, and things like that. So you start tuning it, you start putting things on it, you're changing the pitch, how it vibrates, how it does all that. So now it's changed. So now as a consumer, you're compensating for what it was supposed to be in the beginning. It said C sharp. So now what is it when the heads are on there? It's on a rack and it's in between this drum and now it's got these heads on there. Now it's a little different. So, well, if you're really into it, you take your drum bot and you stick it on there and it gives you a frequency of what range you're in. And so now you could take a piano, you can take whatever. If you're trying to get something to a certain pitch, it's going to take a while to get you into that range to figure out what notes lying in. And you have the top and the bottom and the hoops and the heads to maneuver within that range. So it is difficult. And the hardest thing is copying something that isn't actually a copy of it. And that's where all the techniques come in the studio and reverb and all the gating and all the different processing things that you can put on a snare mic and this and that to make something sound the way it isn't really.
Interesting. All right. I think the last thing we can talk about before we go into like a demonstration is knowing what situation you're going into and then how to kind of prepare for that, how to kind of tune for that, and what to kind of expect for that. So I guess like if we're in a studio situation, big thing like that I've learned over the years working with artists, something I'll ask them is like, what kind of sound do we want out of the drums? Because if we're making a indie record where the snare drum is just super fat and dead and it sounds like there's a towel over it, and then you come into the studio and your snare drum is cranked and it's like a brass shell and it's super high pitched. It doesn't matter how good you play. It doesn't matter how good it's mixed. It's just something about the mix isn't going to feel right because the vibe isn't right. And I want to get your thoughts on like, how do you prepare and what kind of things do you think through when you're going into a situation like that? How do you prepare for that? Sure. Do you tune on the spot? Do you tune beforehand? What do you do?
I think if the situation allowed it, the best possible scenario would to have as many snare drums as your disposal that you can. You know, really, that's the only way around it. I mean, you can have something like a Ludwig Black Beauty. That's a pretty standard, nice sounding drum. You can't go wrong if that thing's tuned up and ready to go. We can make that work. And that's why a lot of studios in Nashville have the same kinds of people and the same people really doing the same jobs because they know exactly how to prepare for that, and they have 100 times. And so it is hard to give an answer to something that you want to prepare for something you don't know. I would recommend that you take 2 snare drums. You know, never just rely on one. It's really good to run around with 2 snare drums if you are in a situation where you have to record. So you have a backup. If you're in a situation where a snare drum breaks, extra snare head. If you don't have, an extra snare drum, at least get just like a really, really thick coated Emperor or something, Evans dry head. Great in the studio. It doesn't have those overtones that you get.
The HD dry or whatever with the holes in it.
Because if you crank it up, it's going to sound decent. And so that's a good way to cover yourself, is to have a nice heavy head on the snare drum because it won't break. That, I think, is the biggest concern. It just doesn't work. Typically, in a situation where you're trying to go for the color, you're trying to, grab the gold, so to speak, and get something to sound really nice, give yourself some options. And I guess, renting snare drums is why I do that. But I think it's more important just to know your instrument. Knowing that, okay, if they ask me to do this, or if I'm prepared for this, it will work for everything. There are drums out there that are kind of really made to kind of cover it all. But if there are those types of situations where you should ask the person that you're working with, especially singer-songwriters, they don't like it when you just kind of change the snare drum on them. If that's what you're using, then you may make it sound as close as you can to the original thing that you had prepared for to do. So if you're in a situation where you have to tune a drum that is in a studio that, might not necessarily been good in the first place, well, that's where your kind of discretion comes in, where, okay, if I tune it really low, and I'm not going to break the head, or it'll get me by. It's just, it's kind of doing what you can to stop the bleeding. And a lot of times it's detuning as opposed to uptuning.
And something I've thought of while you said like have options for what you're going into, maybe bring some moon gels, maybe bring a snare weight, maybe bring a big fat snare muffling thing. Like if you are on a time crunch, you only have a few hour session or whatever, and you got to get a bunch of stuff tracked, and they all of a sudden, we really want a dead sound for this song. It's a lot easier to slap a big fat snare drum head on there and get that dead sound than having to be like, all right, let me retune this whole drum. Give me 15 minutes to get it really dialed in, so sometimes the quick fixes might not be the most ideal thing, but sometimes they might be what's necessary to do it in a time crunch.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you have the luxury, if someone else is buying, get that nice snare drum.
Yeah, of course.
It's a luxury. It's fun to have.
Yeah.
Although I do say that having a $1,500 snare drum doesn't mean you're going to have a $1,500 sound. It's very important to think about it that way too, because you'll be disappointed. They're very specialized. The higher end you go, because that's what they do. That's what cars do. Specialized into driving a certain way. So having the drum work for you, knowing its limitations, knowing what it can and give you, and then you're confident. You're going in, okay, I'm not going to be in that situation where the studio engineer can hear the buzzing in the lug because the spring is vibrating and there's no dampening in it. And you didn't hear that on your vintage 1939 Slingerland Radio King, the first time, and now you have to take it all apart, and there's no time for that. So little things like that, they do come up, but I think the worry comes from being over-prepared too. You didn't, like a lot of times I've gone into studios and we brought 12 snare drums and we used 6. Or we just didn't get to it. It's nice to have options, but you can't overdo it. Yeah. I know these 6 will work, but 12's better than 6. That's good numbers there, but it really isn't necessary, I don't think, all the time. And I think as a player, having something you're really confident that will make your performance better. Because an engineer, too, I've had engineers where, golly, I don't know if that snare drum's going to work. But, the magic and depending on how much mixing time they have and what they're willing to put in, maybe they'll trigger something over the top of that. It's like it can be done. But it's important, I think, to have that good performance where that drummer's confident.
Yeah, have it the best at the source, so that way when it does come to mixing and when it does come, the engineer doesn't have to necessarily fix or try to fully, replace or doctor to get to the end goal. I myself have had to do that, but it's way more easier when everything is right from the source. Everything sounds good from the source. The sound is what you want from the source. It just makes the whole process from beginning to end a lot better and a lot easier to get there.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And it's better too to know what you're giving rather than to maybe try to give too much. It's all a reference. It's important to know what you like, or you're trying to be conducive to other people's ideas. Then it's good to have those tricks, that big fat snare. They make lots of products. They make a product now. I do believe it's by DW. It's a wooden top that goes on the rim, and you play it like a cajon. And so you can turn your snare drum into cajon. All the more reason to really know your snare drum. It's sitting between your legs. It's the most intimate thing that you can, I've played on snares where I didn't hit it where I was supposed to, and that don't feel good. And anyway, we don't want that. It's just, it's so important to know what you're getting from your snare drum. Of course. And what you like too. It's hard to know what you like if you can't experiment.
All right. So now we're going to move on to more of the demonstration part of the episode, where Eric is going to kind of walk us through and kind of put us in a scenario where you have your drum, you have a head on it. It might not be the most new head, but you're about to go into a studio session, and this is something he's going to walk you through his process and how he's going to get the drum kind of tuned up and kind of verbalize as he's going on what he's doing, why he's doing it. This is something you would want to do not on the scene, not at the studio. This is something you would want to do, beforehand, get it dialed in, get it tuned up beforehand. But he's going to kind of show you his method on getting a drum roughly ready to go for a studio session. So Eric, take it away.
Yeah, all right. So you get handed a snare drum, and first a couple of things I want to check out is that I want to make sure that the drum heads don't have any tears in them. So I'm looking at that. I'm looking at the hoop. Now I'm looking at the tension rods. Flip it over, get that snare drum. So look at the snare drum wires, make sure that they're not bent, that they have the even amount of tension on them as we have it tightened up. So I'll go ahead and throw those off right now so they can see what kind of string I'm working with, and then also feel around the edge, the bottom side of how tight that is, so I have a reference point. Then I start detuning, and it also, I've noticed that if I am talking and I get the resonance from the drum, that I get some kind of overtones from that too. So I kind of do like to have things going on. I can hear, I don't have to hit it all the time, you know, and those snares are rattling. And so, you know, you might sing to yourself, woo, a little bit, whatever you need to do, but drop the key on there a little bit, make those snares rattle. And I can already see that it's a little bit wavy right there, which means that the tension at one point was a little bit too tight on one side. So that I'm going to keep in mind when I do tighten down these wires again. I'm going to make sure that that pulls back okay. So as I'm detuning these, I can feel that they're about 2 or 3 full turns tight. So I'm going to take that into reference, and the snare bed, which is lower than the normal bearing edge by about 2 to 3 millimeters, I'm going to make sure that that ripples in a way that is higher on that side than on the side of the rim. And I see that it's been tightened already a little bit too tight on that side, so I'm going to compensate for that, because these bottom heads, they do have a lot of compensation in them. And so really I pull off the heads kind of by hand so I can feel how those tension rods are going in there also. And it does matter too how long they are. It goes inside of the lug a little bit further, which puts less tension on the shell. So I'm looking at that, and as I'm tuning it, detuning it, I see that it doesn't have the washers. So plastic washers are really good because it isolates the rim. It's a good cheap fix if you have any kind of nylon washers. They make different kinds, but that really helps in getting rid of those overtones that you don't want in the studio. So I would change that, but with what we got, we can achieve a pretty good sound. And getting the drum head off is important to kind of detune it in a way where it doesn't pull too much of the head out of the rim in any way. This die-cast hoop, I can hear as it is hitting the metal how much it rings, so I'm kind of listening for that, but that's just something you kind of get used to, listen for different things. But it looks like it's pretty straight, so that'll come off okay. And then I'll detune the snare mechanisms, the snare wires from the snare throw off. Some people wrap them around, which that is wrapped around, which is good. Keeps it nice and even. So you take that, lay that on the snare. Make sure that this is tight, the butt end. That's good. Those are there. Now I'll undo these. Make sure those washers don't fall out of that rim. That's no fun picking them up off the floor. So that's loose. There she is. Set that there. Okay, inevitably you're going to find dirt. Get rid of that. We'll flip it over. Now, we can also tell with the hoop, the bottom hoop off, this is a neat little trick, is that if I tap on this, it's like a timbale, right? But I have no reference point of the bottom head. And so I can hear what this is kind of giving me already, and then that even pitch, ooh, at the end. but then it dies off. That means that this is relatively even in force, and so it's even in tension. Because if it wasn't even in tension, that pitch would die off in the parts that are not tight. And so having that bottom head, it doesn't have anything to reverb off. I can hear the overall tone of the top head. So I have a better idea of how high it can go.
And you're not being confused, or the sound isn't being masked by the bottom head. You know what you're hearing is just the top.
Mm-hmm. And I might hit the shell a little bit just to see if the shell isn't vibrating, then you've got that ply separation that we're talking about. But these black brass shells are great for tone, and they're great for those overtones that you want. And the transference is very, very, very even. So as it's detuning, that's kind of where I find where this drum is what kind of range it's gonna give me. Because if I just tune it there, I only tuned one of the lugs, and I got so much of a different pitch range. So now that's after everything was tight in the same tension. If you detune one lug, you start to create that fatness, the overtones that block each other out, that give us that space that is desirable. But if we get something too high or too low that doesn't give us any kind of space to work with, it's not going to sound as good. And so while I'm detuning the top head, I like to hit it to see how much it affects it. Now this one's almost all the way out, and it still sounds semi-tight. So now I detuned 4 out of the 10, and it's almost all the way dead, but it still has tone. And so now I want to try to get it to sound like a floor tom, because that will tell me how low it is frequency-wise with just the drum head itself laying on the shell.
Okay.
And so that's kind of now it starts to wobble, and because it's not on there evenly. So now this is pulling tension down. So I'll detune all these, and then I'll start to finger tighten it again to get it back up to where it's touching the head and there's no dimples. Well, this is used, so there's a few dimples, but you can still hear that there's an overtone, which is good, because now I know that the head itself isn't pulled out of the glue a certain way, because it's giving me a fundamental note. It's giving me some kind of resonance. I know that it's not completely dead.
So that can be a kind of a good test to be like, all right, that
head's shot. Or if the head's shot, I'm going to crank it up as tight as I can, and I'm going to tape it, or I'm going to deaden it to the point where it's just getting the attack from the bottom side.
How often do you change out your heads? Is it just based off of like this one's worn out?
If it starts to dimple,
or
if it's not giving me the sound reaction that I know it should, or if it's obviously cracked or there's a tear in it or something. I mean, lots of hits doesn't mean that it's not going to be in tune, because if it's tuned and it stays in tune, and it doesn't fluctuate in tension, it will last quite a while.
Okay.
Whereas if it's detuned and things have been tightened and weird and the head hasn't sat on there very correctly, it's going to not last as long.
Okay.
And so, depending on, the heads last depending on how you hit them and how they're used. They do have a shelf life or whatever, but typically you can get some kind of sound out of it.
Yeah.
So we're just going with the best we got. So at this point, now that I've kind of checked the condition of the head and I know how the rim is going to respond to the tension, I'm going to take it all the way off, and then I'm going to check the bearing edge on this side too.
Gotcha.
And so a lot of drums, they have space. I don't know if you can see this, but my fingers that are touching the tension rod, there's just not quite enough space in this one to put my fingers all the way in, which is kind of harder to tighten. I mean, I would use a speed key in that case. And they have drills and stuff. Gibraltar makes one, they put in a drill and it comes right out, which is nice. So I just use the technique there that put my two fingers on each side, and I just kind of spin it around with my hand. And, some tension rods, they have different kinds of drum key heads, like Sonar, they make different ones, so it's good to have the right drum key. Some of them are magnetic, which is nice, so you don't do that. That's why you always have two. Now, on this particular shell, I'm just feeling to make sure there's no dents. If there was dents, I wouldn't freak out too bad, but that can equate to different overtones and you might get a little buzz, from like a flap.
Okay.
If the dimple's touching the head just right, what's happening is the head is inside of the drum, touching the dimple and going back and forth really fast. There's really no way to get rid of it other than sanding it or, molding it or tightening it so tight that it doesn't have any chance of touching any of the sides.
With the edge of the drums, I know there's, what is this cut called, I guess?
This is a round over. So
okay.
This looks like about a 45-degree angle.
Okay.
And so the bearing edge here, when its contact is with the head, is where my finger's at right now.
Okay.
So the bearing edge on this is slightly rounded over, because you can have edges that are not rounded over. They're just sharp, or they're to the point where they have a concave surface. And convex and concave are, in and out of the circle, and the amount of shell that's touching the drum head equates to the resonance.
Okay.
And a difference kind of in pitch and how it's stretched.
Okay.
So, of course, something that is sharper angle, meaning higher, 60 degrees or higher, is a sharper angle, which creates more resonance, more ring time.
Okay.
And so, therefore, if it's rounded, it equates to dampening that overtone.
Interesting.
And transferring it more from the drum head to the bottom head through the shell, and you get that transference more you can kind of even out that transference rather than, making it sharp.
Interesting.
So it looks like this shell's good, ready to go. The snare beds, again, you really can't tell on something like this, but I can feel it ever so slightly. It's got a dip. So everything's good to go, and I'm going to go ahead and put the bottom head back on. And heads inevitably will stretch differently, and this head, I don't know if you can see it, but maybe from the top view, but it has a little dimple in it, which means that this side has been stretched a little bit more than this. So I'm going to compensate for that when I do tune it. So here is where I start to straighten out the drum head within the rim and the drum head touching the shell. So as I tighten these down, I'm going to kind of position that so that it's even all the way around. And I'm moving this back and forth so that it kind of wedges itself kind of in the middle as well. And I can feel how much play is in there.
Gotcha.
Because inevitably those little wings, they have space in there to compensate.
Do you ever put any sort of like grease or WD-40?
I try to stay away from the grease unless it's really rusted, and then I'll grease the insert that's inside of there, because you don't really need to put it on the tension rod, but more so inside of the actual insert itself.
Okay.
So that the grease can go down in instead of come back out at you.
Gotcha.
Okay, so once I got those all hand tight, which the angle is important because then you can twist it. See, now that one right there, it already is touching the drum head, and I felt it catch. And so that's what I'm kind of being aware of now, that I kind of have them tightened, but they're not all the way in. I could still do it with my hand, but because of the angle, I kind of change it to the drum key so that I can feel when it starts to stretch the drum head, so that I don't pull it too much this way. And then I'm starting this one, it'll get tight, but it's already whopper jawed and out of round.
Gotcha.
And so now I've got a lot of play in here, and these are not quite tight, but once I do get them all close to just being on there and just touching it, then I can start to really maneuver it and get it into place before I start tightening it. So get these touching the head and getting rid of all the wrinkles, hopefully with just my fingers, so that I don't over tighten something, and give myself a space to work with. So then I'm also pushing down with my hands to see how much give I have to go to get it tight. So then again, I start right here on this side, which touched first, and this is the snare bed side, so I'm going to give it a half turn on that side. Come over here, half, another, and a little more, because now as this is tightening down, it's inevitably gotten more space because it's pulled down. And so now these inevitably need to be tightened again, because now these are off, because this whole backside has been pulled down, and now this backside has been pulled down. So all these need to be retightened again. And then I go back again and I tighten these again. So now I can see this coming out, and I know that this needs to be tightened a little more here. So I'm going to overcompensate because it's been pulled there already. Barely tighten that side, even more on that side. Come back over here. And now I'm going by feel. And this one wasn't even tightened all the way, so I know I need to go another turn to get it as tight as the other ones. So now I'm going on feel, and I can feel that this is evenly tight. And we could even check if we wanted, just to get some kind of tone. You know, that's really low. That's really low. And it's good because we're already got the ripples out. And now this is where I put the snares on so that I can see how much it's pulling, those snares down. And I like to start on the butt side, the back side, so that because this typically has no adjustment. Adjustment meaning, you know, tension on this side. There's no tension, so I like to start with that because they're stationary. Now I hold this here, hold that down, finger tight, pull this back. Now, because those are finger tight, I can pull this, and this is my tension, and I'm pulling this tight so that there's no slack in either one of those. Now, pull this up, and I know that this is going to seat right because I'm pulling, and it's tight here and straight, so that when this pulls back, this stays straight and doesn't twist those wires. And I give myself as much play as I can here so I take this thing off. Typically, snare mechanisms will come all the way apart if you unscrew them all the way, which the nut stops right about there. So, about 5 turns, then I've got some play. Pick this up. Tighten this. Now I'm tightening it up this way. Now, as I'm turning it, I'm watching how it pulls, and it's pulling evenly here and pulling evenly here, just what we want. Then I'm going to test how much tension it's got. When I hit it, the drum was honking, meaning it's very, very low, so it's not going to give me the response that I'm going to end up with. But I can tell when these snare wires are completely disengaged. And as the wires get engaged, I'm looking to see if the tension is pulled the same, and they are. So I'm going with that. Now I'm going to tune it up just a little bit so I can get a little bit higher note, and those snares will respond more. Now I can hear it go up. Start there. Okay, the luxury of doing it finger tight is that I can feel how much tension is touching on the head. So then I know which way I want to start. Based upon the head rippling in one way, I'm going to kind of pull this side down. So that tightens that side. Then I'm going to go in this star pattern. And I like tapping on the back just to I can hear the pitch now. Here it comes. Little high to me. So then I come down, and it's important when I do detune the top head, I always go more detuning than I compensate, go back up.
Start low.
Start low, go past where you want to tighten up, and then tighten back up to it, so that the tension rod is in the motion of tightening rather than loosening, because it will work itself out quicker.
Because if you want it to be lower and you just go low and leave it there, there's a little bit of natural like give in the lug. So you go low and tune up so that it's tight where you want it to be, not.
Yes, so it's in the tightening motion rather than the detightening.
Very smart.
And we do have one of these, one nice dead sound. Now, if we want to change it, we'll go lower. Oh, please go lower. Yeah, we'll try that. Again, detuning it all the way. But I'm going half step. That one's loose. Detune that.
And you're doing about a half turn looser, or what are you doing?
Almost a half and then back up. So it's a quarter. Gotcha. I always go into quarter intervals because they go too much, then I have to kind of start over because I went past it too far. That's even. I mean, and we have play, the snares, they rattle, rattle, tighten. We got options. Now also, you see a lot of people will hit the lug over here. They're listening for that overtone to see if it's in tune with the other ones next to it. So sometimes if it's quiet, I like to hit the rim, because the rim will change too. If the rim is too loose, it will be lower pitch. Okay. If it's giving a high overtone, it might be too tight in one area and loose in the other. So that's a good thing to do too, especially back on the backside where you hit the back sticks. Voila.
Wow. That you definitely earned your name of the drum doctor.
Well, we like snare drums.
That's impressive.
So if they want to change it, it can be done rather quickly. It's hard to have all those things going on while you're simultaneously listening to what's going on through your headphones, or you're trying to get microphones placed, and that's why it's important to go through all those things, because then you can get oh, this needs some washers, or this might, like you said, be lubed up over there, and some grease on there, or a new drum head or something, or your snares aren't working quite right, you want to switch them out for different snares. And the number of snares matter too with all that response, but that's ready to go.
Awesome. Well, sweet. I think we learned a lot here. Thanks for doing this.
Absolutely.
Thanks for being a guest. If people want to reach out to you, is there a good way for them to contact you?
Yeah, the email, nashvilledrumdoctor@gmail.com.
So if you have any drum questions
Absolutely.
or whatever, reach out to Eric here. And this is a lot. I learned a lot from this. I'll be watching this episode over multiple times. So
right.
Really appreciate it, Eric. Thanks
a lot.
All right.
Thank you, Max.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone.